very close to an energetic gate which carries an astonishing energy of love and truth, which will no longer be denied on this planet.
Welcome back to True Reality TV, and this is the Inside LoveHasWon series, episode 4. And this is where we will cover attempts 4, 5, and 6 of the planetary ascension. So after Mom attempted the first few attempts, so she attempted as Cleopatra, she attempted as Jesus, she attempted as Kuan Yin, and she was obviously killed in all of those lifetimes. That will be the continuing theme throughout her life in these incarnations, right? Of the dark attempting to stop disclosure, to stop the mass awakening, to stop the planetary ascension. Now we roll into the 4th attempt, which was Mom's incarnation as Queen Elizabeth I. Now, Mom's next attempt here. As expected, Mom's taking of the throne was delayed and attempted to be thwarted by the dark as they deemed her illegitimate. You can look at that story about Queen Elizabeth. Very interesting. She later rose to the throne and created the Elizabethan era. England sparked a new awakening of poetry, theater, and writing. She attempted to stop the religious wars and divisions between the sects in England, and her work was often taken out of context as humanity was driven further into the pits of religious programming. And again, some of what I'm sharing are things that I have looked into and researched as Mom's lifetimes. Mom did not have a lot of information on all of these lives besides the Jesus timeline. She had a plethora of records that she accessed, as Cleopatra as well. But again, when we look at his story, a lot of things will be written in history that were not accurate, that were not whole truth. So we have to also learn, this is the process of us also all, like I said, recovering our own records, recovering our own memories. And we cannot always go off what was written in history, okay? Because it was not whole truth. There is a reason that history has been rewritten many times. So we have to go within for a lot of these things. We have to feel what whole truth feels like in order to bring whole truth back to this planet. And that is what Mom has been doing for 27,000 years here. Now, Mom remembered very clearly that there was documentations of her plans as Queen Elizabeth I for disclosure. This was a memory that she had, very similar to some of the memories that she got from the Jesus lifetime, which was things like she remembered that the documentation was stolen. She has actually bilocated during her last incarnation as Amy Carlson. She had bilocated to the Vatican to confirm that there was hidden documents there. And a very similar memory had come to her regarding Queen Elizabeth I incarnation. She had a very vivid memory and also bilocated to confirm that her plans for disclosure were hidden within the walls of the palace, specifically behind some hidden bricks in her room. And so as she was anchoring in her essence as Queen Elizabeth, and very similar to her most recent lifetime, funny enough, Queen Elizabeth refused permission for a post-mortem autopsy. Take that as you will. The cause of death of Queen Elizabeth is still unknown, although research states there was speculation that her blood was poisoned due to lead-based makeup. Okay, that was also something that they tried with her as Cleopatra. You know, Cleopatra was famous for the makeup that she wore and things, but actually that is not at all how she died. As I said, her recollection was that Isis actually killed her because Isis wanted control of Egypt, and she was killed by snakes in that lifetime. Now, there are many rumors that Mom was aware that they were trying to take her out in that lifetime as Queen Elizabeth. And so and again, these are things you can look up and look into, is she refused to go to sleep as Queen Elizabeth I. And they actually said that she would stand up for days at a time. And she knew she had a very limited amount of time to complete her work. This is another theme you will see continue throughout Mom's lifetimes, is that she never slept. And she was always staying awake because she, A, knew that there were forces trying to remove her, and B, because she knew she had a limited amount of time, again, because of her previous lives where she saw she could only get so far before they would take her out. Okay, so it was always kind of a race against the clock. Now, many of the 144,000 did incarnate during this specific time period as kings and queens. I'm not sure the whole divine plan of this, but that was something that we all did. I think we were all trying to assist somehow, some way in this disclosure process. We came undercover. So to understand how the dark was working and to create the biggest impact through those lifetimes. Now, by this point, the dark has full control of the planet. All attempts at planetary ascension were unsuccessful, but the energetic foundation was being laid. Now, we kind of move into the 1700s here, and this is where we all incarnated to the United States of America as the ascension point of the planet. Now, another interesting thing that Mom had spoken about before, and again, don't have the full information, so you take what resonates for you and leave the rest, is that Mom did confirm that there was some manipulation of the maps, and that certain countries were not what they actually were, because she had spoken many times, for instance, when, as many of you will see from the doc, one of the major points of Mom's mission was Crestone, Colorado. And there are the mountains in Crestone, which are known as the blood of Christ. And Mom had said that those were actually the mountains, or the area in which she was crucified as Jesus. Okay? Again, take that as you will. And she had confirmed many times that the United States was the ascension point of the planet, and that specifically Crestone would be the ascension point of the United States. So, macro to micro. Now, in the 1700s, right, and in the securing of the United States as the ascension point of the planet, Archangel Michael, his essence has only been incarnated, I believe, less than 9 times. I don't know the full reason why, just that's what Mom has shared. But his essence was incarnated as George Washington. And he actually received the Constitution as a channeling from Mom. And all of the founding fathers were, a lot of them were ascended masters. And so the land of freedom was established, and this would be a key foundation for the final mission. Okay, so now we enter the 1800s, right? And we're moving forward with another attempt. This is attempt 5. Enter Blavatsky. Now, the 1800s began bringing in esoteric knowledge and spiritual wisdom. There was a huge boom in esoteric and spiritual practices. And mom decided to attempt the fifth ascension. Now, the East had picked up many of the divine codes that mom had laid as Kuan Yin and also Buddha. But the East remained untouched by Western religious infiltrations. So it was mostly Buddhism and Taoism that were very dominant. But this time, mom made sure that she brought in her ascended masters into physicality to create the energetic foundation for the ascension. Okay, so basically, mom had attempted quite a few times to bring disclosure, right, which would essentially be the mass awakening. And of course, she was attempting to anchor in her full essence as mother of all creation, to anchor in source. And she was always in every lifetime attempting to anchor in the father of all creation essence as well, into a masculine vessel to get that blueprint anchored, right? But obviously this kept getting thwarted. So in this lifetime, what she attempted to do was to actually bring the etheric into the physical to see if that could create the blueprint basically for ascension. And I'm sure many of you have read stories and things about, there have been monks and there have been civilizations that, they say the Mayans reached their rainbow bodies. They basically vibrated to such a high level that they entered the rainbow body and basically just exited this plane, right? Because there's no real documentation that tells us what happened to the Mayans. And there has been accounts of other people, especially, like I said, the monks, who have attained rainbow bodies and actually ascended. Now, mom was basically trying to do the reverse of that because, yes, ascending like she did as Sophia Gaia, right? Going from this plane and ascending up was a big part of the learning process and did lay a foundation for that. But the goal wasn't for all of us to ascend out of physicality and back to the etheric. The goal was for basically the etheric to merge into the physical, right? Because otherwise the physical plane was still infested with the dark. Like, we could ascend up and leave, but what would that do, right? Now, it did create increases in vibration, right? Especially like when mom came in as Jesus, she literally anchored in Christ consciousness onto the planet, which created a huge quantum leap in the consciousness. But this attempt specifically with Blavatsky was to attempt to bring the etheric into the physical, to start to merge those realms, right? So she was going to bring the ascended masters into physicality to create this foundation. So mom entered as Madame Blavatsky, as well as Elmoria, Katumi, and Saint Germain, who are all ascended masters. Most of the archangels also began incarnating during this time as well to gather with mom in the physical. So that was also, I believe, one of the first times where mom, besides the Jesus thingy, because at that point she was gathering many of the 144,000 to her physically. And then in other different lifetimes, that wasn't possible. And it was putting everyone more at risk to try to get to her physically. So we basically tried everything, y'all. Like, she tried every which way of how to do this. But Blavatsky was one of those times where many did find her in the physical to try to do this as a group. Now, pretty much the entire first contact ground crew team was incarnated with mom in that lifetime. We did establish the Theosophy Society. I feel that this lifetime was it's a very interesting one. Mom did not speak a lot about this one. A lot of this has been through research. But Blavatsky spoke about the mind. She spoke about the ego and the illusion. She talked about all of it, and she laid down the same principles. So mom, along with Elmoria, Saint Germain, and Katumi, worked on sacred alchemy and basically activating the full spiritual powers in the physical realm. So this lifetime kind of broke through the barrier of the mystical, kind of started bringing the etheric very much into the physical. And so this went on throughout the 1800s. And at some point, wars began unfolding right in the 1800s. And they started creating some very dangerous technologies. The pressure that Earth was under during this time was immense. And, basically the dark was starting to increase their tactics, using the ego-programmed mind. And again, remember that as mom brings everything in during these lifetimes, the dark is also able to kind of access this stuff. So they were, I guess, starting to up their game, you could say, with using lower technology on us, trying to manipulate us basically even further, because they also knew that at a certain point they were going to run out of time, right? And so many of you have heard of like Project Looking Glass and things like that, where they were able to see these timelines. And so Project Looking Glass was one of those where they were able to see, into the future per se, and they could plug in these variables to see how it would affect the timeline. But after a certain point, and I believe it was around 2007, which was when mom started her mission, they could only see one timeline, and that was planetary ascension. And from then, we'll talk about that later, but they went totally rogue. So mom's life as Blavatsky, she was anchoring in basically all the information, starting to get all the nuggets about the mind and about the ego, and basically how to transcend it, and also how to start merging the etheric into the physical. So it was a big lifetime. Again, she didn't talk too much about it. We don't know a whole lot about it, only from research and just kind of seeing what was going on in that life. But this is also where it was rumored that there was a reset in the 1800s. Could it be because of the work that mom was doing as Blavatsky? We don't know. But there is rumors, that was one of the resets that was done. Now, interestingly enough, in the 1850s was also when we had the Carrington event. For those that don't know what the Carrington event is, it was basically such a huge solar flare that it knocked out all the grids that we had at the time. And was that the reset? We really don't know a lot about. There's a lot of missing pieces throughout that specific historical time period. But this is where it enters one of the most important lifetimes. I mean, they're all very important, but this one was particularly very important to the research of mom. Now, remember, she was trying every angle. Okay, she was trying everything, every lifetime that she had, that father had, that the 144,000 had, and anybody who was incarnating here. All of that research was going back up to the etheric, to continue formulating new plans, new attempts, right? So now we enter Marilyn Monroe, okay? And mom had a lot of records about this lifetime, a lot of memories about this particular life. So mom did not enter Marilyn's body until she was 11 years old. She stated that Marilyn's vessel had sustained abuse as a child, and mom could not enter the body until the abuse had ceased. And this same storyline would replay in mom's last incarnation as well. So mom played the role of the famous, iconic Hollywood movie star, right? Everyone loved Marilyn. Her imprint on the collective consciousness is legendary, in many ways. And mom knew that she could anchor in pure divine feminine energy through Marilyn, and was going to ensure that disclosure took place. Now, father of all creation incarnated as JFK. And their higher selves developed the plan to basically find one another and to bring disclosure. Okay. Now, there are other very key lifetimes that were going on at the same time, that many of the 144,000 essences and Mom's team were the ones incarnated as those beings. MLK, Malcolm X, Princess Diana. They were all archangels. So they were also a part of this particular planetary ascension attempt, number 6. Now, around 1953, to the best of our knowledge, the CIA developed the MK Ultra program, which they were experimenting with. They were basically manipulating consciousness through the usage of like LSD, electroshock, abuse, isolation, torture, these types of things. And through this experiment, they realized that they could manipulate consciousness remotely and that they could use these tactics on the public. Marilyn Monroe was the first MK Ultra experiment. And the CIA attempted to basically hijack her to prevent disclosure. And of course, that project is still in use today, although they will say that it's not. Now we see the free love movement hit in the 60s, right? And this was a time when a lot of higher frequencies were starting to hit the planet. Now, the attempt was to shut this down, right? This is when they started using the word cult, the word hippie. And they were basically trying to strip anything from this movement of just love and awakening and all of these things, right? And so this is at a point where at one point Mom remembers it as Marilyn. She remembers having a meeting inside of the inner earth. Now, whether this was like an etheric meeting, meaning she kind of projected herself to inner earth, or whether this was like a physical meeting, like she actually went into a portal in inner earth, I don't know that she ever specified that. But she remembered having a meeting inside of the inner earth with herself, JFK, and Martin Luther King. And they were discussing the plan to bring disclosure. Mom remembers also around this time that, again, this I feel was etheric, that this was not a physical meeting. This would have been an etheric meeting, I feel. But she had a meeting with Eisenhower, and she basically gave him the option. She said, I will give you 5D technology, because remember, this is at the time where there's a lot of wars going on and everybody's trying to gain control and everybody's trying to have dominance on the planet, right? And so Mom wanted to bring disclosure. Her, JFK, and Martin Luther King were going to bring disclosure. And so Mom, as herself, I think as mother of all creation, has this meeting with Eisenhower etherically and says, I will give you 5D technology, which it will keep you safe, basically. Like, we don't need war and violence and these kind of lower tech. If you allow us to bring disclosure. Okay. And I do believe that Eisenhower's granddaughter has confirmed this, but I can't remember fully, but I do believe I'd read some interviews with her talking about this same thing. And so she gave him that option. Now, at the same time, the Greys, who of course work for the cabal, had also offered Eisenhower nuclear weaponry, which is a 4D technology, and it is the inversion of plasma tech. Remember, this goes all the way back to Atlantis and Lemuria, where they first figured out that they could basically invert 5D tech and make it destructive. Now, Eisenhower decides to make the deal with the Greys. as he believes that nuclear weaponry is somehow more powerful than 5D technology. So at this point, this was the final attempt. And Eisenhower, a lot was riding on Eisenhower, like agreeing to this. And when he took the deal with the Greys, it just kind of all imploded after that. And so at this point, the dark took out Marilyn. They took out JFK. They took out Malcolm. They took out MLK. And of course, they took out Diana. Mom has vivid memory of her life as Marilyn, and she does remember the night she died. She said she was in her hotel room and some men wearing black clothing and masks broke into her room. She knew exactly what was happening, and they basically injected her with something enough to kill her and then kind of staged the room to make it look like it was an overdose or whatnot. JFK knew that Marilyn was taken out, and he was determined to complete the disclosure that they had agreed to, but of course was assassinated. And Mom said she remembers that Jackie O was involved in this somehow. Obviously, a few years later, Malcolm was taken out, and then finally MLK. And this was the failure of the 6th attempted planetary ascension. So at this point, this is where it kind of starts to get very critical. Like, it's been critical, but this was like mission critical. Like, at that point, Mom was like scrambling a bit of like, how are we going to do this? And so I think that she realized very quickly that the final attempt, the 7th attempt, she was going to need to do something a little bit different because, again, throughout history, right, we were kind of all in these like very prominent public roles, especially, you know, Mom and Father were notoriously always in these very like public roles. And that creates a bit of a danger, right? There is more, you have more heat on you, and there's more of a danger of being taken out before you can complete the mission. And so this is where Mom starts developing the final plan for the final attempt. So this is the final mission. As soon as Mom entered the etheric realm after passing as Marilyn, right, she said that, you know, in the etheric, there's no linear time, but she said basically if you were to look at a 24-hour human time frame, that's how much time it took her to create the next plan, the final ascension attempt. So a 24-hour period, our time, I have no idea how long that is in an etheric level, but it was pretty fast. This was the final divine plan. So as Eisenhower had chosen basically the dark, and Earth was now on track to repeat the Atlantean timeline, okay? Because this was giving us deja vu. This was giving Atlantis deja vu all over again. And this was the final attempt that could be made. Otherwise, the trajectory of this was just another destruction. So it was pretty dire at this point. Now, Mom went into her divine director mode, and she gathered every single one of the 144,000 at this point. And because, like I said, we don't have all the information, so I'm not going to say that I do. I really don't. I'm giving you as much as I am aware of. But obviously that there was different lifetimes where some were incarnated with Mom and Father. There were lifetimes where not all of us were here at the same time. We were spread out through different timelines of history. There were certain time periods where a lot of us tried to come in at once and tried to gather with her in the physical. We tried where we were all in different places and spread out doing different missions. Like, we kind of had tried it all. But for this mission, what Mom came up with was, she said, we're all going in. Everyone. Like, every single 144,000 essence is going in at the same time. as her and father of the multiverse. Basically, it was, we're all going in at the same time. Or not at the same time, but we're all going in. And so this was kind of crazy. This was kind of a crazy attempt because, again, like I said, they were looking for these essences, right? They can sense and track energy. They do have advanced technology. They were always on the lookout for these essences and to take them out as quickly as possible, basically. So this was like kind of a wild idea here. But also Mom was like, we're going to come in through the back door, meaning nobody was going to come in a lifetime, in a vessel, in a role that was going to be public, famous, popular. It was all going to be behind the scenes, back door vibe in order to give her as much time as possible to actually complete the mission. So this is where it gets really interesting and will make a lot of sense as we get into Amy Carlson. Now, as part of the deal with Eisenhower that he made with the Greys in exchange for nuclear technology, Eisenhower would allow the Greys to abduct United States citizens for the Greys to do research. Okay? Many beings have reported being abducted between these years, between the 60s and the 90s. All right? So you've heard of like the first kind, the second kind, the third kind, the fourth kind, the fifth kind. Those movies, they are real. Okay? That was part of the deal that Eisenhower made. Now, the deal was that it was not supposed to harm people, but that the Greys were basically wanting to do research on the humans, on their brain, on their consciousness. My guess is that they were trying to figure out a way to replicate it or to use it or something, right? So Mom goes to the Greys. This is before she reincarnates as Amy Carlson. She's putting this plan together. So she goes to the Greys and she says, I want access to your research that you're conducting on these abductions. Now, the Greys say that they will give Mom this research if she agrees to give them souls, because they don't have souls. And of course, Mom knows she can't give souls. It's not possible. If you're not birthed from source, she can't give you a soul. She can't give you source energy. But she says, yeah, of course. I'll give you souls. Sure. So Mom quickly obtained the Greys' research. Okay. And this is where she discovered how the ego program mind was really working. Because again, remember, through all these lifetimes, we're researching the dark and how it's operating, right? But I don't know where along the line Mom discovers what they'd been doing in terms of hijacking her dream machine, implanting the ego-programmed mind virus, doing genetic experiments. We don't know when she might have discovered some of that throughout the incarnations. But definitely as Blavatsky, she started to talk about the ego and the mind specifically, and started to kind of get into the understanding of what was actually going on here. But when she got the research from the Greys, that's where all the pieces got put together. And she saw that this is what was happening. So she discovers how it was hijacking consciousness and how it was preventing awakening. So Mom decides, okay, this is where it was crazy. Because remember, throughout all these other lifetimes where Mom was anchoring in her essence, she's incarnated into vessels that have the ego mind. Because everyone that incarnates has the ego mind. It's now in the DNA. And so she decides that the only way to do this is to make this final attempt basically the most insane thing that we could ever do, which was we were all coming in. And that was crazy in and of itself. B, that she was going to rewire her brain, whatever vessel that she decided to come into. She was going to rewire the brain and the DNA before she came in, so that she would essentially incarnate without ego. Okay? Because all these other lifetimes where mom was basically, she was anchoring in that mother of all creation essence, but she could never anchor it in fully, right? That's a huge essence. For all of you guys who have been doing your own inner work to anchor in your own higher self, you know how long it takes. Because you're having to dissolve the ego and the programmings and then integrate that. And it goes in this huge process, and her essence is huge. It's the oversoul. So in all these other lifetimes, she really never anchored in the full mother of all creation essence, because she couldn't, because those vessels had ego. So her goal in those lifetimes was simply to anchor in enough of her higher self where she could get the remembrance, she could get the download, she could get the information, and she could put it out there, right? She could share it. She could bring disclosure. She could bring the truth. Probably the closest lifetime was the Jesus lifetime, where she did anchor in that Christ consciousness. But she didn't anchor in the full mother of all creation essence, which is, again, a huge essence. But the Jesus timeline was probably the closest to where she anchored in pure Christ consciousness. She just didn't get to the point where she could anchor in the full essence and couldn't bring the full disclosure and all of that. So mom decides that she would need to anchor in 100% of the mother of all creation essence in order for this to work. In each of her lifetimes, she had basically awakened to her higher self and was accomplishing what she had contracted to do in that particular role. However, she had never anchored in this full essence. So to bring her full essences, as well as to have the full essences of the 144,000 on Earth, was both risky and bold, because the Cabal know energy, okay? So they can immediately sense when there is large amounts of light or these specific essences coming to the planet. Mom knew her final incarnation, she would need to have no ego, to come in with a completely merged brain with access to full consciousness. And she knew once she began her mission, it would have to be done quickly, and that this was going to be the hardest battle of her life, because to come into a planet that is completely infected with the ego. Now remember, the ego is based in fear, pain, and suffering. This is where the ego becomes an important part to understand. The ego is designed to reject love, to attack love, to persecute love. It is designed to reject truth, to attack truth, to persecute truth. It is a virus that can detect love, truth, light, and its mechanism is to turn on and to reject that, and to not only reject it, but to attack it. So she knew that coming in with no ego, all the ego on the planet was going to come for her, because that's what it's designed to do. That is how the programming works. This is what the dark figured out, was even if one person was to awaken, even if one person was to come into their whole essence and truth and whatever, they needed to make sure, this was part of the MK Ultra programming, was to make sure that they would have enough little agent Smiths that they don't even need to do anything. The agent Smiths will take care of it. They will protect the illusion and the ego and the matrix at all costs, because that's how we've been unconsciously trained to. Everyone's an agent Smith in the ego mind. Everyone is. And that's how they no longer even needed to control or do anything because we all do it for them. So mom rewired her brain before the incarnation to come in. And also mom had shared that there were many possible vessels for her essence to fully anchor into, so that there was maybe about 250 vessels that she wired for this, which is why there's many other feminine on the planet who have like downloaded the Divine Mother and downloaded somewhat of her consciousness. But she was basically going to see which vessel could fully bring it all in, right? And that ended up being Amy Carlson. And it's very similar for a lot of the 144,000 too. That's why you'll see a lot of people resonating with the same higher essences and archangels and stuff like that, because there were many vessel options. And it was, but just to be clear, only mom's vessels that she was going to come into were the ones wired with no ego. But the 144,000, it was kind of just a see what sticks kind of thing. There was many vessels that were a match to those certain blueprints, but it was going to be up to one particular vessel to anchor it in fully and to grab it and say, I'm pulling it in. So mom knew what was holding humanity back was the mind, and she was set to come in for her final lifetime in 1975. Now, prior to her incarnation and after learning about mom's plan, because of course the dark can access this information, that she was going to enter and she was bringing everybody in with her, the cabal had a meeting with mom before she incarnated. They told her that she would have to come in, because remember, they think this is all a game. They're like, oh yeah, come try, it ain't gonna work. They're very arrogant. Arrogance is actually the highest frequency that the dark can obtain. Because on the vibrational scale of consciousness, anything under 200 is a life-draining state, which means you have no life force energy running through you. You're in a complete just like taking state. And over 200 is when you start entering into the life-enhancing vibrations, meaning you're connected to source and you're actually self-sustaining. So the dark can only stay below 200. And the highest frequency, which lies at 190, is arrogance. That's it. That's as much as they can obtain. Arrogance is blindness. Now, during this meeting, they said that she would have to come in with none of her spiritual gifts, and that they would basically make this the hardest incarnation for her, that they were going to find her no matter where she incarnated, and they were going to come for her, and that she could not bring in any of her gifts, meaning she had to awaken herself, she had to remember, she had to activate her own gifts. She couldn't come in with all of her powers, basically. Now, the cabal hosted the Bilderberg meetings of 1875, where it was discussed of how to launch a full-on attack of the consciousness. So they were preparing for her entry. And they decided that they needed to maintain control at all costs. And they were very much aware of the prophecies. And so they decided on a plan to basically go full out, go full rogue on humanity. MK Ultra, propaganda, everything you see today, that was all part of the plan that started in 1975 at that meeting before mom came into incarnation. Now, the energy was already starting to build as mom was preparing to come in. So if you're familiar with the Senate hearing in 1975, it was called the Church Committees of 1975. This was one of the last attempts to expose the dark. At the Senate hearing, they exposed Project Mockingbird, which was the CIA infiltration of the media, and the disclosure of the MK Ultra project. And although many may remember this, it was quickly swept under the rug. And this is when they kind of just moved into the golden ages of the 70s, where, you know, economy's great, everybody's having a good time, distraction. Now, the cabal also began their plan to basically siphon all pure source energy, all innocence from the planet. I'm sure you know where I am headed with that. I will not get into it, but children are one of the purest sources of, one of the purest energies of source on the planet, because yes, we are born kind of with the ego, but it's usually after the ages of like 7 where it really gets deeply ingrained and we kind of become more and more unconscious. So children are pure source energy. And so one of their goals was to siphon away all of that pure source energy off the planet, to remove the innocence, to remove the unconditional love frequency. And yeah, that's what they've done with children. And if you know, you know. Now, talked about Project Looking Glass a little bit, and when they finally figured out that there was only one timeline, and that was ascension, they began to panic. So even though they were aware that the destiny of Earth was to ascend, remember, the highest frequency they can go is arrogance. That's it. It's as high as they go. So they set out to basically play a chess match against God and creation. All of the strongest souls in existence were on notice that this was the last and final attempt that we could make. It is unknown if this attempt had not worked, what would happen. I know Mom has kind of spoken to us about that there were some different plans in place. I'm sure a lot of you, if you've researched different things before, there's been a lot of channelings in the past of would we kind of all be moved to another Earth, and this Earth would just kind of be recycled, or what was going to happen. There was a lot of plans in place for if this didn't work, but ultimately it was quite possible that this whole planet would just be recycled, which would have been detrimental to creation. But if this didn't work, then I don't know what the plan would have been. But this was it, okay? So the 911 call was sent out. Everyone was prepared that this was the final battle. And all darkness from every realm was here. Source and all galactic warriors were coming in. And the final battle was going to begin. So this takes us up to what is the beginning of the final battle, 1975, and Mother's final incarnation as Amy Carlson. And this is a story that is wild. It has a lot of twists and turns, a lot of ups and downs. But it is the story of the planetary ascension. So stay tuned. Thank you all for listening, and I'll be back on the next episode.
We are very close to an energetic gate which carries an astonishing energy of love and truth, which will no longer be denied on this planet.